Hi, I'm Carmen.
I'm Dalton.
I'm Alexis.
I'm Charlie.
And
welcome to Cult Explorers.
Today we'll be discussing a rather heinous cult. It's known as The Family. One of the main nicknames. There are also several other ones, but we're going to give a quick trigger warning today. There will be mentions of child neglect and abuse, drug usage, torture, a mention of World War II, kidnapping, possible sexual abuse, and other violent topics. This podcast is not recommended for individuals under 16, and listener discretion is advised. Let's get into it.
A little bit of an overview of the cults of the family. It's also called the Great White Brotherhood, and it's founded by Anne Hamilton Byrne. This cult took place in Australia, just outside of the city of Melbourne. Anne kind of became a spiritual leader in the family and claimed she was Jesus Christ reincarnated.
Yeah, she was a very charismatic person. She first was actually a yoga teacher, so that gave her persuasive and power of influence because she helped out a lot of women in a time where yoga was first becoming popular and was also seen as a religious or a mystic thing. And she typically taught yoga to middle-class housewives around Melbourne. But it definitely put her into a power of influence and gave her leeway to some of the wealth that she later gets. She used her charm later on to recruit some of these people from Melbourne into her cult. And it honestly went from just these middle-class housewives to elite doctors, lawyers, psychiatrists, and more. And it led into an awful spree of drug usage, kidnapping, and other horrible factors.
Not only did she use her charisma to lure members into the cult, it's also believed that she used her charisma to lure her third husband, Bill Hamilton Byrne, into marrying her. He was a business owner and he was a very wealthy mayor in a part of Australia at the time. And it was believed that he was captivated by her, just like everybody else and like the members of the cult. He was seen as a puppet and that Anne was controlling him and his involvement in the cult.
So, a little bit about Anne herself and her background. Anne Hamilton Byrne, as we said before, was an Australian yoga teacher in the 1960s. She grew up in a small farming settlement a few hours outside of Melbourne, and she was born in 1921 to Florence Hoyle, I don't know if I'm butchering that, and Ralph Edwards. She was born with the name Evelyn Edwards, and it's actually not stated as to why she changed her name later on and became known as Anne Hamilton Byrne. But she also did a lot of identity changes for her members, so it's not something we won't see later on. At a young age, her mother actually died. She passed away in an asylum after being diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic. Ralph struggled as a single parent, and he could not hold down a job, so Anne often grew up in and out of orphanages, which obviously at the time were not in the best condition, as foster care wasn't really a popular thing throughout these years. About shortly after marrying her first husband, they actually gave birth to their first child, and I'm pretty sure it's Anne's only stated child. That's actually her biological child. But shortly afterwards, he passed away in a car accident. She had a second husband, and as was stated, she also had a third. Anne was heavily drawn to yoga due to its connections with Eastern religion. A lot of people were very curious about it in the Western area, and it was presented as something of mystery. And she began teaching it to, as we said before, middle-class housewives in Melbourne.
It's funny that you mentioned like all the abuse that she went through when she was younger. It reminds me of the Manson family and how Charles Manson, he was like abused by, he didn't know his dad, and his mom had him at 16, and then he went to live with his aunt and his uncle, and he was abused just from a very young age. And we don't know if Anne was abused or not, but it's clear that she went through very traumatic experiences. So I think that could have had something to do with her potentially creating this cult.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, something you tend to see in cult leaders is that while charismatic and persuasive, they tend to get this manipulative caricature, I guess you could call it, of like their personality tends to be very charismatic and stuff because they grew up through something traumatic possibly in their life, went through something traumatic when they were younger, like her first husband's death. Not much is stated about her child and what happened with her, but also then being in and out of orphanages, losing her mother at a young age. That's definitely something that can influence someone to be more manipulative later on. Definitely going through something traumatic like that. Later on, Anne, using her yoga classes that were becoming so popular in Eastern culture, actually used this to build a larger reputation for herself around Melbourne, not only as this wondrous yoga teacher, but a spiritual leader. And this actually led her to meet one of the co-founders of the family, Dr. Rainer Johnson. He often described her as having New Age wisdom, and he stated that she was unquestionably the wisest, the serenest, and most gracious and generous soul he had ever met. Together, her and Dr. Rainer Johnson began experimenting with LSD. And in this, he also introduced her to some of his fellow co-workers, such as nurses and doctors and a few lawyers. And mainly just because they were searching for guidance related to her quote-unquote New Age wisdom that he was so often bragging about with her. And then they actually ended up recruiting these individuals and creating a headquarters in the outskirts of Melbourne at one of his properties, which he referred to as, and excuse me if I butcher this, Santinican.
So at this headquarters, the group would hold weekly meetings, and during these meetings, Anne would deliver her quote-unquote messages, which was a mix of Hinduism, Buddhism, and Christianity. And she would often state that, as previously mentioned, that she was the prophetic reincarnation of Jesus Christ. And she gained even more followers through one of her members, whose name Marianne Villemek, who managed the New Haven Hospital, and that's a psychiatric hospital that treated many patients with LSD.
And yeah, that definitely hooked a lot of those patients in, because as stated before, they were already experimenting with LSD at the time. It was very popular in the 70s. Lots of psychedelics were popular then in many groups that you'll see, but this is definitely one of the things that hooked people in, was the drug usage. There is not stated, however, if there was any kind of trafficking with those drugs. And then just a little bit more about Anne. I mean, she grew up in really, really poor conditions, as stated before, but at this time, she often adorned herself in fine clothing, jewelry, and honestly anything to show off her fortune and wealth after the creation of the cult. And this drew people in as well, because, I mean, when you're preaching that you can bring this and that you're the reincarnation of Jesus himself and that you have the characters of Buddha and other deities, and then you're this rich, and people are going to believe you at the time. I mean, this wasn't an uncommon thing. New religion was coming around. It was really popular. People were more spiritual. Things were picking up in the 70s. It was changing. It was a big movement. I mean, the 60s to the 80s was insane for everybody. Everyone was trying new things. And to everyone else, she was an urban socialite. She used her highly persuasive personality to put herself in a position of influence past just being a yoga teacher, you know? And, I mean, she ended up creating this plan in general as like some kind of master plan, she later stated, to start World War III or a race war. And this plan itself, though it may sound crazy, at the time, this amassed nearly 500 people through her recruitment processes. And these members were so devoted to her, and they gave her everything. You see that a lot of times in other cults. They gave her money, every valuable asset, and later on, as we'll see with what this cult was honestly revealed for, was their children, and more than just their children.
As you previously mentioned, how she liked to show off her riches and everything, I think that's why she seduced her third husband, Bill, because like I said before, he owned his own business, and he was a mayor in the part of Australia where they lived. And he was overall a very wealthy man.
Yeah.
And so I believe that's why she seduced him into marrying her.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, she definitely wanted more access to wealth. She wanted out of the life. As you see in a lot of cult members, they want out of the life that they had previously. And that's what they use to draw other people in, because they know that these people relate to them in the aspect of they want to be taken from the life that they were previously in. They're looking at something to complete their life. And, I mean, and definitely welcome that as unfortunate as it is.
Yeah, I think that's why you see her go after a lot of members who are considered like the elite of society, especially in Melbourne College. That's what she really went after with Dr. Raynor Johnson and stuff. She went after lawyers and doctors and nurses and stuff like that. People that were very highly respected and that other people would listen to. It wasn't like she was just going after people with not a high education or anything. She was going after the absolute elite of society, and so they could help her recruit other people, and she would gain influence like that, and people would listen to her.
Yeah, and that definitely made her a credible source. To just think, someone coming up to you, recommending you something. What are the individuals in society that we listen to when we need help? It's doctors, it's lawyers, it's nurses. Things and people in those positions are who we look at for help. And so when they're recommending something like this to someone who needs guidance, someone who may be lost, which a lot of individuals who are involved with those things are going through hard times, they're gonna take them as credible sources and believe them about her, and that definitely helped influence how she later obtained our younger members.
So like in the early 1970s, that's when the cult really started. They falsely adopted, I think it was 28 children.
Yes.
And some of the children in the cult were offspring of the members of the cult, but others were falsely adopted by Anne and Bill, and they were told that Anne was their biological mother and that Bill was their biological father. I saw this video where an ex-member of the cult, she was born into it, and she had been told up until she was 13 that Anne and Bill were her biological parents. And she believed it until she turned 13 and she started thinking about it. She quickly learned that her actual father was a member of the cult and not Bill.
Yeah, she definitely presented it, Anne herself presented it, that it was part of the devotion to her to give up your child. I mean, you look at a lot of religions and new religions today, it's devotion, full devotion is honestly assumed. And so that wasn't uncommon for her to preach. And so giving up your child, if that was part of full devotion, it didn't seem uncommon or wrong to them at the time. I mean, they were completely brainwashed into believing her. I mean, she was brainwashed herself by her own antics. She was not who she claimed to be. Obviously, her name was changed, her identity was changed. She was nothing like how she grew up, and she went with it. She went with the influence that she was given, and it's really sad how she used it. Honestly, one of the past members, I think this is the one that you were mentioning, her name is Sarah Moore. She was born and raised in the cult, and she later spoke on how not only did they tell the children that Anne was their bio mother, they would often repeatedly dye the children's heads blonde so that they looked like her, something that is a very Hitler-esque motive behind it. She wanted them to be perfect, and Moore herself even quoted later after escaping the cult that I think one of the things she wanted was lots of little children, little perfect little children in perfect little dresses with perfect little blonde hair. Something that you would have seen, honestly, in times like World War II, which wasn't even like far behind when this happened. I mean, you're talking like 20 years, maybe 30 at max. So it was definitely a motive that was unfortunately going around at the time. Then speaking on how she recruited these children, as stated before, there is through a lot of falsified adoptions. Like we stated, there were lawyers and doctors and nurses a part of this cult, and that was the main groupage of the cult. And so it was really easy to get past the legal precautions around adoption, whereas the nurses and doctors had an easy time convincing new mothers to put their children up for adoption, and rather than actually putting them up into the legal adoption system, it was sent straight to Anne, and they made it seem legit. They changed the identities of these children, gave them false birth certificates even.
And it also would have been easier for parents to give up their children to Anne because they see her as a trusted figure. They see her as a prominent figure, and they think that their children are going to be well taken care of.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and they couldn't even get behind it with the law if they did figure anything out, because the lawyers in the group served as credible sources as well to keep law away from all of this. I mean, every single person, including people who weren't even in the group, the community itself was completely brainwashed. And it's really sad because they had a lot of brainwashing techniques that we later find out are not too pretty. So, I mean, at the time, we know that people in the West were fascinated with Eastern religion and its practices, past just the yoga in the 50s and the 60s. And Anne definitely used this to her advantage. One of her main brainwashing techniques, as previously stated, was that she was the reincarnation of Jesus Christ. And you're living in a conservative time. Though things are changing, it's still a conservative time. And at the time, Christianity, and still is, was the biggest religion. So to say that she was the reincarnation of Jesus Christ himself was definitely something that hooked people's attention.
So we're going to continue with crimes. When the cult was raided, Anne fled the country before eventually being arrested in New York in 1993. She never served jail time for any of the crimes, none of the child abuse, the hitting, the beating, none of the fraud, anything that she took from her members. She was convicted of fraud and fined for $5,000 for falsifying the documents of 3 children that she said that were biologically hers. 3 triplets, I think.
You mentioned the mistreatment of the children. I think it's very understated how terribly the children were treated within the cult.
Yeah.
If the children misbehaved, they wouldn't be fed. And if they misbehaved, they would get beaten by Anne, Bill, or one of the caregivers within the cult.
And these caregivers, by the way, they were referred to as aunties, or aunties, however you say it, wherever you're from. Anne herself would also do this. There were women who were appointed to these positions. They would often have to wear stiletto heels simply for the fact that if a child misbehaved, they would take them off and beat the child with the stiletto of the shoe itself, which is horrible. It's so heinous. It's something that just past the starving the children and hitting the children and yelling at the children and kidnapping them. That's horrific because out of everything, a heel to hit a child is one, but to hit them with a sharp heel is I don't know, it gives me chills. It's really sad. I mean,
are they pointy enough to make blood?
I feel like possibly, yeah. I mean, they could obviously, break or something.
Yeah,
but
break skin.
It's like a dull kind of tip, but pointy enough that, I mean, just look, if you were to hit, have you ever walked in a football field in heels and it kind of sinks into it? That's similar to, I guess, I would assume that's similar to how flesh is. I mean, flesh is really thin. Imagine hitting a child who's not even fully developed. I mean, it's just really sad because you can think of not only if it didn't leave marks or if it did leave marks, that's still pain toward the child. And I definitely feel like stiletto heels of all things. It's just, I don't know, that was something that caught my attention. It was really weird.
It gives me chills.
Yeah. I've never heard of that. I've always heard of in cults, you see a lot of, trigger warning here again, a lot of child sexual abuse, actually, in child marriage. That was not something that was seen in this cult. She actually saw these children as her children, but she abused them at the same time to hold her power. She was definitely in between. Did she want to be a mother? Did she want to be a heinous leader? It's really sad.
Yeah. They were given Valium to keep them calm until they were 14, and then at 14 they were given strong doses of LSD.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, see, no, I didn't see that part. That's really sad. That was, like I said, it was really common in the 70s, but not something that was common with children. So it's really sad to know that not only were these kids forced and born into this, they weren't just recruited like everyone else. They were forced into this, and then they're being forced into what later would probably be a drug addiction as well. I mean, we don't have many victim accounts, unfortunately, because of when this took place, but it's still really sad to think that at such a young age, they're already being not only forced into this, but forced into a different lifestyle that they really don't have a choice in any of this at all, and they can't question it because, like many cult leaders, if you question Anne, things didn't turn out too good.
You're done for.
Yeah, you were done for.
And Anne was just so controlling of these kids and things that even if she was away, she would make the aunties and caregivers, just whoever was watching over the kids, she would make them call her and make sure that they were being disciplined and stuff. Like if the kids acted out, she would have them call her and she would listen to them, punish the kids, and she would just always be checking up on them to make sure they didn't misbehave and stuff like that.
One of the boys in the cult was nicknamed Zebra Stripes by the other children because he wet the bed every night and the bruises were almost permanent.
Yeah. And one thing with children, especially under the age of 5, but just children in general, before their preteen years, wetting the bed is a really, really big sign of the abuse that they're going through and PTSD in a child. It's really sad, but that definitely shows that it was affecting the children. They didn't see this as normal. It was something they were just forced into, and it's really heartbreaking that so many of these things were done to them. Yeah.
And like since this took place in the 1960s, 1970s, a lot of these like one's children, they could still be alive right now and still struggling with drug addictions because of what Anne and the members did to them.
Yeah, like Charlie stated, she fled. No one knows really what happened to her until she passed away. She fled, so what happened to the cult members? We know about, as we stated before, Sarah Moore, because as you'll find out, she is the reason why the cult kind of fell and why it was discovered, I want to say. It wasn't that it was closed off and secretive. It was just, they were hiding stuff, you know?
How the police found
Yeah,
out.
that's how the law got involved. These other children we don't know much about, and what's sad is that no one knows if they were rehabilitated, because not only were they just raised there, they were only kept in the cult. These were not children who got to go to school and got to experience socializing outside of the members there. They had a large enough family that, like you said, one of the children even nicknamed one of them and bullied one of them because that was their only kind of socialization was abuse, and being amongst those people, there was no one else that they could go to. Otherwise, this would have been discovered a lot longer. All that they knew was what Anne was teaching them, and they could not question the cult's ideologies because what happened because of that. And they thought all of this was normal. None of them willingly went into this. Obviously you have the first members who went in looking for guidance, but did they really sign up for this either until they were brainwashed? It's no one's genuine fault. That's the sad part about cults, is that there's no blame to be put on anyone, because at the end of the day, everyone's brainwashed, even themselves, such as Anne.
And everyone's vulnerable. And I can only imagine, many of these kids were told, Anne is your biological mother. So whenever, the raid and everything took place and Anne disappeared, I can only imagine what they were going through, thinking,
Horrific.
Oh my God, my mom is gone. I don't know where she is.
Yeah.
I don't know these people. I don't trust these people.
Horrific. You got to think the people that they might have been left with past law enforcement were those aunties who were constantly abusing them. It was so that they abused them more than Anne herself did, because Anne was often away preaching her messages, even though Anne was the one ordering it. How are the kids are supposed to know that? They're just children, and I don't know, it's heartbreaking to hear, because to this day you don't know what happened to them.
They were lost in a world that they knew nothing about.
Yeah, they've drowned in history. It's horrible, because you look at rehabilitating kids today who are involved in abuse and traumatic living situations, and there's already a struggle and a controversy surrounding that. Imagine what it was like in the 60s and the 70s. Like I said before, foster care wasn't even really a thing. It was, but to a minimum.
It wasn't as big as it is today.
Yeah, it didn't have the government regulations up to date, so it wasn't something that you saw a lot of times. It was more just taking kids in.
It's orphanages.
Instead
of foster care.
Yeah, and they're like psychiatric hospitals at the time. There were not a lot of regulations. They were almost, I don't want to say they were almost as bad as the cult, but they definitely shared some of the crimes, but they were able to get away with it. I think that definitely influenced Anne's behavior as a mother later on, unfortunately. And you see it in other instances where kids, even when it's discovered that they're in an abusive family, they are still attached to their mother, because that's a child's instinct. That's a human instinct to go to your mother for help, no matter what kind of behavior they are, authoritarian, like Anne was. That's still their mother in their eyes, and so they were still very attached to her, and it definitely was something that played into their trauma.
So back to the brainwashing and how Anne and Bill were able to brainwash their members and taught their members that there was going to be a third world war and that the world's population was going to die and that she needed to create this quote-unquote superior race to survive and lead the world after the apocalypse was over. And many of even the children were taught that one day that they were going to need to take over the world. And so Anne would force them into a vegetarian diet and do yoga and exercise to keep their bodies and their minds strong to one day take over the world for this world war that they thought was coming.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that was also where the LSD came in. They used that as to obtain a superior, pure mind, which you see in a lot of other cults. It's really sad. As previously stated, Sarah Moore is one of the very few children of the cult that can be later seen quoted. She is actually the reason that the cult fell in the first place. In 1987, she was kicked out of the cult for quote-unquote hyper-rebellious behavior. And a few months later, Sarah's friend Leanne also escaped the cult. And together, they went to the police about what was going on. Obviously, they weren't on the drugs that were being given anymore. They were hyper aware of what was going on after being kicked out. They saw, this is not a family. You don't kick someone out of the family, And the raid that later took place was actually caused by what they told the police.
And all of the children within the cult were taken into custody by the police, and at least 24 of them said that they were abused by Anne and the family. That is the majority of them, because, mind you, there were at least 28 children within the cult. So only 4 of them didn't come forward and say, we were abused by Anne. And that's not to say that they weren't abused, but they could have been scared to come forward out of fear.
Or they could have just been that young, But just a little happy, sad note. As we stated about Sarah and Leanne leaving, Sarah later got to follow her passions and she became a doctor. Unfortunately, she was unable to get over what she experienced in the cult and suffering from severe PTSD and trauma-related health issues. She died at the age of 46. And then Leanne actually now lives with her family, and she's trying to live a stable life, but not much is known about her and what she's going through. You can only assume in this situation, especially with the publicity that this cult has gotten over the past few years.
So we are going to talk about where is Anne now. She was placed into a nursing home in 2007 when she was diagnosed with dementia. In 2019, she passed away with dementia. She was only ever convicted of fraud and had to pay a fine of $5,000.
Only fraud.
Only fraud.
That's horrible, and only $5,000 at that.
So mad.
At that time, $5,000 is probably worth more now.
Yeah.
But even then, $5,000,
that's it.
I hate to say it, but let's look back at other criminals who were caught for other reasons, usually, frauds. What they go for when they can't tag a criminal for something, like Al Capone. Even he served jail time and paid more, and it's really sad that I feel like they didn't push. Law enforcement definitely failed us here. Sorry, but it's really sad.
Did. Yeah.
Yeah. Like I said, they definitely had the influence in the group to keep law enforcement away, but it's horrible.
It's sad because so many kids came forward saying, we were abused by Anne, and she never got convicted of that.
And what's even worse is even now today, so many people come forth with their abuse, and you'll see groups like CPS, and they do nothing. It's like they focus on the wrong things, but you have these individuals. Not only do you have one individual, you have 24 different individuals stating lifetime of abuse, and there's no way they didn't find the false adoption papers and stuff. It's awful. It's in the drug usage. Mm-hmm. There's no way children didn't tell them about that. LSD, it's not legal now. Wasn't legal then. Has never been legal. They obviously did not investigate that. If there was no charges related to that. Only accusations, no trial. It's really, really, really ridiculous.
And it's probably because of her husband, because of how wealthy he was. He was able to afford... She was able to afford such a high-quality legal team.
Yeah.
And
even then, he shut people up, probably.
Yeah.
That's really sad, but that's the truth of it. Anyone with money has the power to shh and throw away the key.
yeah.
And with her dementia, she'll probably never really like understand the repercussions of what she did to those children.
And even then, she went through something traumatic as a child, and she brainwashed herself. Like, it's stated from the few victim accounts who are known that she genuinely believed she was the reincarnation of Jesus Christ. Like, this wasn't just something she presented to get people to come in. She actually believed this as well. She believed all her teachings. I mean, she was in drug usage as well. She definitely had addiction issues. This was a matter of, she was even a victim of herself. It was really sad to hear.
She was so damaged.
Yeah.
And it just goes back to the saying, hurt people hurt people.
Absolutely. I mean, and this does not excuse any of her behaviors. Heinous, it's horrible. But you got to look at it from an objective perspective. It's sad because we can't even get a full account from her. There was a quote from her, and I'm going to butcher it and paraphrase it, but she said, "I had to do it. It was the divine way for the divine ways." She was fully convinced, and it's awful because, like you said, I mean, with dementia, she'll never fully quote. She'll never fully come to. She will always be in that state, or always would have been in that state of never being able to be truly, responsible for her crimes or understand that they were genuinely even crimes. I mean, she didn't have a childhood either. She was never adopted. She grew up in the orphanage. She was in and out of it. I mean, it's really sad because she didn't really know how a child was supposed to be raised either, but it does not excuse any of her behavior, but it's just looking at it from an unbiased point of view. Everyone in this situation was unfortunate victims of both themselves and of our main perpetrator, Anne.
And it just sucks because her husband, when I was looking at victim recounts, they said he was just as violent when it came to the physical abuse of the kids.
Absolutely, yeah.
And he was described by one of them as savage and horrible.
That's so sad.
But they also said he was idolized by the kids.
Mm-hmm. Like I said, a lot of abuse victims, especially seen in children, idolize their one or more of their parents because they have no one else to look up to. And they are isolated to these individuals. I mean, who else do they look up to,
Mm-hmm.
Anne's their leader, but they can always idolize someone else. I mean, she loved him, quote unquote, I mean, she also loved the children. So it's definitely something that you got to look at. And it's awful. There's not even words to describe. I'm stuttering over it right now. It's just, this is something that breaks my heart. Something that I cannot imagine recovering from because this is going to keep me up at night.
I don't know if the kids in the cult ever truly recovered because it says that nobody even attempted to seek psychological damages until Anne had died. And even then, there's been no court rulings for them having to pay psychological damages yet. So
yeah, they were exposed to what they went through, and it makes you wonder, where are they now? What do they believe in now? And do they still think they're a victim of the law, or do they think they're a victim of Anne, or do they not know at all? Did they go back to their biological parents? Were their biological parents even aware that this was happening? And what happened to the members who, quote unquote, donated their children to the cause? I mean,
it's just terrifying.
It's horrible. It's bad.
And it's an insecure attachment when it comes to the kids because while they went to Anne and Bill for safety, for comfort, because that's all they knew.
All they wanted.
All they knew and all they wanted. They were terrified because it was a horrible situation for everybody involved.
They knew it was the only place they could get comfort, but it was also the only place they got abuse. Closing out, we're going to give a little deep dive on cults itself rather than just this one and talk about the type of this cult and where it lays in different dynamics. I mean, it's hard to label a cult as anything other than absolutely horrid and terrifying and heinous, but I mean, we can get into more of the scientific side. Dalton, if you'll give us a lead.
Okay, so we feel like this cult can belong to a few different categories. We think it could be a new religious movement because Anne was teaching yoga and all the Eastern mysticism and stuff during the 50s and 60s, and everybody was just so captivated by her, and she was so charismatic and stuff like that, and nobody had really ever seen anything like that. Her messages were from Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, just so many different religions, and it just kind of captivated everyone and all of her members.
Definitely went away from the traditional aspect. Like I said, things are changing in the 70s. You're rolling, you're kicking through it in different ways, and she definitely took advantage of people wanting something new and something different in the spiritual aspect. But you can also look at it as a doomsday cult. I mean, New Age isn't usually talked about, but doomsday is, if you want to look at that. I mean,
yeah. Her just views of kind of like a World War III where everybody in the world is going to die, and she had to create a master race to lead basically the new world after what was going on. And she also claimed to be Jesus Christ incarnated, so everybody was just so devoted to her. Like the cult was solely focused on her,
really
as a
apocalyptic
source of information and stuff.
Yeah.
And also, it's kind of like the Manson murders in a way that she's just like, she claims to be Jesus Christ incarnated, and also the use of drugs. But everybody was just so devoted to her. At that point, it wasn't even really on their ideology; it was just on her and how she what she said. What she said went. There was absolutely no questioning her in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, I feel like this cult definitely holds a lot of labels, as many do. It's definitely something that we can question a lot, but unfortunately, it at the end of the day, it's a cult. And how we see cults and how they perform throughout history is increasingly heinous and just horrible, label or not, scientific or not, factual or not. I mean, it's a cult. And so with that, we appreciate you listening. But before we go, we're going to give some quick little sources that we used in case you want to look further into this cult and the mysticism behind it and its crimes and anything that we might not have touched base on. This was a really, quick, short podcast ready to go. So I'll list a few. We can all list a few. Just, I know one of the ones I looked at was a detective actually showed this on ABC News. It was just the death of Anne, and they quoted it calling it one of Victoria, Australia's most evil persons. And then that is, again, ABC News.
When I was looking for my information, I found the video about Bill Hamilton. It's entitled Bill Hamilton Byrne, the Man Behind Anne. And you can look for that video on cbsnews.com.
If you want to go on the Sydney Morning Herald, you can look for a story by Kay Northover, and it's called The Tragic Story of the Family, and how the cult's founders eluded authorities. That's a main big summary on the story if you want to look at that. And then there's another one by The Age by C. Johnston called Not the Messiah, Anne Hamilton Byrne's Legacy of Ruined Childhoods.
And when I was searching for my information, I found the article Australian Cult, the Family Leader, and Hamilton Byrne Dies from BBC News to be incredibly informational and useful for...
Yeah. And then also, I'm not exactly sure the film name, but apparently there was a really popular film that was actually featured in the Australian Melbourne International Film Festival in 2016 that premiered and showed a whole docuseries or documentary on the family cult. And I'm definitely gonna be checking it out after that. I think you guys are. I'd love if everyone else did, and it'd be really something interesting to look into, you want to know more. But anyway, thank you for listening. It's good speaking. Well, not good. It was kind of sad, but it was nice speaking about this. Again, I'm Carmen.
I'm Dalton.
I'm Alexis.
I'm Charlie.
And this is
Cult Explorers.
Bye-bye.